Carolyn is another longtime student of Theosophy, many, many decades, and she will be telling us about the United States Constitution.
Well, I'd like to thank you in advance for being willing to sit and listen to a talk on the United States Constitution at 8:30 in the evening after a long day. And perhaps you'd rather have a discussion about whether or not Donald Trump will be impeached. I myself guess not, because I think he'll be escorted out of the White House by his generals and given a free ride to one of his Trump towers. The Constitution is, of course, an important document, but I doubt it will bring the same sense of inspiration, but perhaps of relief. It's not, there's no direct evidence of influence of Theosophy on the debate and decision-making for the Constitution. But later, stay waiting, I am going to suggest several points on where I think Theosophy has an influence. The U.S. Constitution is the oldest written constitution still in operation. The Brits, of course, have had an unwritten constitution for 500 years, so no one can compete with that. And what I'd like to go through to keep it manageable is a little bit of history, quite a bit of philosophy, and some political science, and leave us room for some questions. So could we have... Okay. Constitutions are filled with lots of detail. The United States Constitution is relatively short, about 5,000 words. The Russian Constitution, Indian Constitution, much, much longer. But stay above the detail and keep three ideas in mind. Incidentally, the handout is for you to think about, read. If you're not interested, leave it on your seat. But it is something that gives elaboration to this short one slide. It could be seen as a blueprint for the exercise of authority, and authority in the sense of having, you might say, permission to make legally enforceable decisions. There's a much deeper notion of authority, going to its Roman roots, of bearing weight. So one can bring that in also. But it does three things. A constitution gives permission for the exercise of authority. It also states or limits the exercise of authority. For example, states are not allowed to make treaties with foreign nations or tax other states. And part of number two is a constitution can be a way of declaring the legally protected rights of citizens, and that was seen as quite important, although the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, was not added until after the first session of Congress in 1891, and James Madison, with Jefferson's insistence, said you've got to put that into the document or it won't be doing what it's supposed to do. So a constitution as a written document is, there you go, it's explicitly ratified, and it contrasts to government by tradition. Most of the governments of world history were established either by conquest from within or without, or simply the development of tradition. So you were born into the government tradition of where you were born, and that was it. Nothing else was to be expected. It is also, because it's written, publicly available for scrutiny and can be interpreted, which happens, and used in the future. Now, this is now a reality, Although the Constitutional Convention was held in deep secrecy, the delegates were sworn to not talk even at the taverns where the state delegations met. But in time, it is a piece of paper that you can get a copy of and think about and debate and write your senator or try to organize another constitution. It becomes a source of obligation and it's a source of political stability. Here's the rule book. Everybody can look to the rule book. Sorry, that's not allowed by the rule book. We're going to court. And very interestingly, with the immigration bans that President Trump attempted, they were put back in his face very quickly, and 2 district court judges declared at least a temporary injunction on them. And I don't think he understood how quickly that was going to happen because of the perception that he was violating the Constitution. Very importantly, a written document with procedures for taking office, getting election. It allows for choice and the rotation of government leadership. So it's a rejection of inherited monarchy, of any form of imperial government that doesn't allow for any change in leadership. There are, of course, historical sources for constitutions, the Greek and Italian city-states, and the philosophers, like Maurice mentioned, like Cicero, Aristotle, put a great deal of effort into retrieving and organizing and publishing the 30-plus constitutions that the Greeks produced as a foundation for their polis and its politics. The part of the strength of the U.S. Constitution is that it was developed in a context of long experience with government. The leaders at the Constitutional Convention, and indeed at the earlier Continental Congresses, had been leaders in their local and colonial governments. And Britain had the King James I back in 1619, after he realized the trading company was not going to be effective. He took over the Virginia colony, but gave in to the demands of the residents that they have a kind of House of Burgesses. So he let them have this legislative body that could make recommendations, not binding decisions. But thereafter, and of course the Puritans, when they landed, converted their charter to a charter for government, not a charter for a business. And they used effectively the model of town government. Within less than a century, they had given charters to 92 towns, which, having just spent 2 weeks in Massachusetts, it's just amazing the proliferation of towns and city governments, and they're still functioning pretty much like they were functioning 200-300 years ago. And there are other examples of early on in Virginia, setting up a public works department, county justice. So we're really talking about a long curve of development and experience in self-government, but the governor was still going to be appointed by the king once the British took over the colony seriously, and he would have veto power on whatever the legislation did. So, but still, if you compare the problems of government today in Afghanistan and Iraq, just unable, it seems, to establish stable, effective government, one of the explanations is that they have not had the long timeline of experience that was true in this country. When the crunch, and there's all kinds of details that we're all leaving out about how the British came to be hated rather than loved. But there was a lot of acceptance of British authority. But 1763, at the end of the French-Indian War, the tables turned for a number of reasons, including the British forbidding the colonists from going over the mountains and settling in the Ohio Valley and pushing out the Indians. The British chose the Indians because they were a source of the lucrative fur trade. So lots of conflict developed, and what you have is a meeting of congresses. Now these congresses, 1774 and 1775, were not authorized. They were revolutionary meetings. They did not have permission to do anything. And interestingly, the Second Continental Congress not only approved the Declaration of Independence, but they assumed government, and because there was no alternative at the national level, they governed until September 1781, 1 month before the war ended. So again, a completely unauthorized body takes over the function of national governance. And of course, the British did not recognize this as legitimate at all. And they made an army, they made George Washington head of it, they started to raise taxes. So they were definitely, from the British point of view, they were just spoiled brats rebelling against responsibility. And they also, interestingly, even before the Declaration of Independence was adopted, they sent a message to all of the 13 colonies saying, make a constitution. And they did, in less than 5 years, and many of them just in a few months, and transformed themselves from colonies to states, and began to govern like a state government governs today, making laws, and believing that legislation can bring about change. And they were very interesting. For example, one change the northern states sought was to end the punishment of bankruptcy by prison terms, and said it doesn't make any sense, it's too harsh. They had had Shays' Rebellion, so we're going to allow for just a way to pay your debt. We're going to fine you, and better to be out of jail and earning money to pay your debt. And that was a huge relief, because that was a big issue. And so those 13 colonies became active centers of self-government even before the war was starting in a big way. By 1780, and even earlier, they were governing. That takes a lot of burden off the system, so to speak. They then did finally adopt the Articles of Confederation, and in September 1781, and in doing so, they thought they had what they needed. They did this article, under this article government, there was one big issue they accomplished. Right after the Declaration, several states, 9 states, 8 states, started to make claims to the Western lands. By the victory over the British, the new United States doubled its size, and all that territory was out there, hopefully to be sold and make money, but they kind of skipped over that process. And in a famous dinner with Jefferson, Hamilton, and Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton, and who's the northerner up there? It was Madison. They worked out a deal that Virginia gave up its land claims. They were absurd. Connecticut was claiming part of what is now Wisconsin. And all of them gave up their claims and accepted the fact, very important, that there would be new states created. And so, as you well know, we have 50 states, not 13. So that was an important principle, that it could grow, the United States could grow, and you share political power with others. The But the Articles of Confederation, they were bankrupt. If you look at the historical facts, you can find that it was near collapse. Britain and France were not trying to protect it or work with it. Aside from war, death, the states were fighting over ferry rights and fishing rights and a host of things. And it looked pretty grim. One effort to raise taxes was voted down. There was no executive, no judicial. And Madison and Hamilton, I think, you'll see pictures of them in a minute. They were the ones who kind of started maneuvering to have a new constitutional convention. And they managed to have one meeting that nobody came to. So they tried again the next year. Meanwhile, Madison spent the winter studying all kinds of constitutions, and they met in May of 1787, the 25th, 2 weeks late because they had no quorum. The governor of Virginia, a man named John Randolph, had put forth 15 resolutions. The first one, we're just meeting to consider revisions, which is the way Hamilton had posed it. Things were very shrewdly done. And then he gave the other 14 resolutions, and they showed that they really had in mind a whole new document, a whole new plan. So they met, and if you read Catherine Bowen's Miracle at Philadelphia, it's a very easy book to read. It was a dragged out, particularly on representation and legislatures, dragged out one by one. They would make a resolution. There was no order to it. And they worked cleverly as a committee of the whole, which meant that they could just do straw votes and no record officially of who said what. And that got them through. Finally, by September, they're getting afraid that everyone's going home and giving up. And the Pennsylvania delegation, which included Benjamin Franklin, said, we got to do something. They met in his library, took all the resolutions, and wrote it up in a plan that we now have. And the last thing they put forth was the preamble. Like when you write a term paper, you don't write your introductory paragraph till you've already done the paper so you know what you're going to write about. That's a little bit the way the Constitution was put together. So, yeah, go ahead. So here's one of many depictions of the convention at Independence Hall. So you had that historical ambiance to give a little bit of motivation to these delegates. George Washington would stand up when they were in the Committee of the Whole. He's recorded to have said just two things in the whole convention, which lasted till September 17th, which is why it's called Constitution Day. This is the location, just to give you a little flavor of that, and that helped. And these are the two activists. Not so well known, of course, Hamilton more recently has gained fame, mostly for his role as Secretary of Treasury under Washington. And here we're going to briefly look at some of the key ideas in the Constitution before we look at the theosophical influence. The preamble, again, written on the Sunday before the Monday in which they all gathered to sign this document, and we'll go to that in a minute. Notice it has two surprises. We, the people, are the authors of this document, even though it was held in secret, and at most about 60 men knew what was being discussed. But this gives an authorship, a legitimacy, and it obviously rejects, James I's claim that he gets all his authority and wisdom from God directly, divine right of kings. So that kind of argument, tradition, whatever. No, we the people. So that gives it a source of legitimacy. And then to make it reasonable, well, these are all the good things we're going to do. Like provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. Obviously, in the legislative process of the day, there's very little attention to that kind of language, but it is there to say we're up to some good. These are going to be our reasoned goals. The Constitution has 7 articles, and 3 of them are part of the theory of division of authority, which was not a new idea to them. Harrington, Locke, others had written a great deal about this idea of distributing authority, more in a bit. They had to deal with federalism and give the states their marching orders, but set limits severely, and that was the rub in a number of ways. And they allowed for change. We're going to have a blueprint that allows for change, and indeed there have been amendments, many of them over voting rights. Other kind of a catch-all, but there's a very important part of Article 6, the Supremacy Clause, that basically says this Constitution, the laws made under it, and treaties are the supreme law of the land, not a person. The Constitution is the supreme law, the ultimate authority, though behind it stands the people. And the way they enforce that is to say the judges in every state must abide by this supreme law, because they knew that's what counted, is local judges for actually enforcing the constitutional rules in practice. And then a ratification process which is brilliantly clever. They knew they'd have problems getting it ratified in state governments because, hey, we don't want this. New York says we can get along without a national government. But instead, they said, we're not signing approval. You don't have to sign approval. You sign the documents with a recommendation that goes to the Continental Congress under the Confederation, and that they send it to the states, who then organize special elections for delegates to special conventions in each state, and they will decide whether or not to approve it. And of course, they ran back and got all their friends to run to be delegates to these special constitutional conventions. And they really outwitted the conservatives in this. So they did get finally, and they didn't have to be unanimous, 9 states was enough. And through this whole process, Rhode Island stayed out of it and didn't even come close until 1791 to joining the Union. So they did get ratification. They could say, well, since the delegates were elected by the people, that's democratic. And it's not being imposed upon you. And of course, what comes later are more amendments. Just briefly, the idea, divide authority by function. I'd like that point this morning that was made about diversity kind of divides the work. And they use that. We're familiar with checks and balances, that you not only would exercise legislative authority in the Congress, but the president has a role, namely with the veto power, but then the Congress can override the veto, which is what Trump knew last week in the bill to impose more sanctions on Russia. I mean, the vote in the House had over 400 votes for it. Of course, they're going to override his veto, and that would be embarrassing. The commander-in-chief, but yet he doesn't have any money. They put in all money spent by the United States government has to be in the budget, or has to come from the House of Representatives initially. The Senate cannot initiate financial bills, so clever little thing there. The Electoral College, we can't trust the people to vote the president. Some demagogue will go out there and say all kinds of outrageous things, and so we're not going to have the popular vote, and there's also the small state argument. And the legislature, more recently, 1974, after the Vietnam experience, said, we're going to require the president, if he sends troops overseas to hostile areas, to come to us and after 48 days and decide whether he can do it. So there's a lot of little tricks in the document. Now, one of them is very controversial and has been used by presidents in the 20th century, is so-called necessary and proper or elastic clause. It's in Section 8 of Article 1. After listing all the explicit powers that Congress can do, it can say, raise an army, raise a navy, set up post offices, tax, regulate interstate commerce, few other in that list. And then Hamilton got this clause in, which seems like it gives away the store, to make all laws, this is Congress, which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other parties. And so does that mean the Congress can make any kind of law they want? Well, you look back at the New Deal and what Roosevelt got through, kind of looks that way. That there really isn't any limit on what kind of legislation Congress can pass. Sometimes it's obvious, like when there are airplanes, let's go ahead and organize an Air Force. But the Civil Rights Law of 1964 was linked to the interstate commerce, and to say that without protection, African Americans could not do business, particularly in the South, fairly if they couldn't use facilities like hotels, restaurants, on an equal basis without discrimination. And Southerners still protest that use of the Commerce Clause. Go ahead. There's the impeachment authority. As we can see, there was a rejection, we'll point to this another way, of any one person having supreme, complete authority. And there's a lot of worry about a president. They really debated that for a couple of weeks. They thought, well, we should have 3 presidents like we have. And that was seen as not very wise. Franklin convinced them. So, but what are we going to do if this president becomes a tyrant? We're not a monarchy, we're a republic, we want it to do the public business. So they put in this clause, the possibility of not just the president, but all civil officers can be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And one of the reasons Bill Clinton didn't get convicted is that it was really hard to make the case that what he had done was a high crime, although you could say it was a misdemeanor. But you might have questions about that. Go ahead. One of the sources of stability provided by the Constitution is it does create these 3 institutions of government: Congress, the President, and the Supreme Court and federal judicial system. But it also, lots of other commissions and departments and things like that. So there's a place, some office of government that has a job and is supposed to be doing it, and you can go to it for help, and lots of debate over that. And do institutions narrow the vision? That's another question. Go ahead. We talked briefly about federalism. One of the clever things they did, and that's still pretty operative today, is let the states do all the business having to do with health, welfare, policing. So that's behind some people's view of the Affordable Care Act. You have the federal government completely out of anything to do with health care, health insurance. That's part of the police powers. Awkward phrase that doesn't just refer to policing. So let them do all that business. Let them decide what's legal, what's illegal, for all the things that don't really affect the national interests like trade or invasion or things like that. And that was pretty much the pattern until the 1920s, when it became obvious that the states couldn't handle a lot of the business that had developed. We had become nationalized as an economy and as a society, and the federal government needed to get involved. But so again, it was kind of a smart move to keep this new national government out of those things that directly involve people's lives. And guarantees for others, citizens in other states. You get a degree in Pennsylvania, Mississippi has to recognize it. You get a marriage in Ohio, then California has to recognize it. Although the gay marriage has raised some problems, but the Supreme Court decision of 5 years ago basically said that states can go ahead and the national government can go ahead and recognize and protect same-sex marriages, and that's another story. Okay, lots of amendments, and this is important, of course, because this is where you get right down to protecting individuals' freedoms, opportunities, and it includes both just your daily life, but also a lot of rules or protections in the criminal justice system, which have sometimes been honored and sometimes not. We have a mixed report card on that, but through a number of Supreme Court cases in the last 30 to 40 years, most of these protections have been adequately enforced. I want to kind of go through, because this will come up again. Go ahead. Role of Supreme Court. They assumed, John Marshall was another clever guy, and they assumed the authority of the Supreme Court to test the constitutionality of legislation by Congress. Very controversial. Jefferson was absolutely opposed to it, but John Marshall outlived Jefferson. He was Supreme Court Justice for 35 years, and that was plenty of time to enforce his viewpoint there. And so that's why you get this review of even state court decisions helped by the Civil War outcome by the Supreme Court. And so that's another factor of limiting the authority of any agency of government. That whole idea of testing constitutionality, the focus was on Congress. By now, every single action, including if a sheriff stops you and keeps you stopped for over 20 minutes, could be subject to judicial review. The Stanford newspaper by students came into review by the Supreme Court as whether they had protection from the authorities of the university to block certain unfortunate stories. Okay, go ahead. Okay, this is what I really want to, where does Theosophy come into this, this story, so to speak? Because it doesn't come directly. But thinking it through, and I had never before thought to take the Constitution and take theosophical ideas and see how they interacted. But I came up with these correlations, and these are just some ideas, they're not absolutes. Very importantly, the Constitution provides a unity, a framework. No government action, no politics has any validity, legitimacy, if it's not done within the framework of the Constitution. So there's a basic unity, which of course Theosophy stresses a great deal. It provides rules, laws and action for government and politics that I think are kind of analogous to laws working in nature. And it's already been mentioned, natural law was something vivid in their minds, okay? Or another way to put it, the Constitution, with its distribution of authority and due process regulations, allows karma to work out. So you can say, well, we're going to take it to court and follow the Constitution, and then the karma can work out within that framework and hopefully come to more agreement. Again, we distributes authority. That gives multiple sources of initiative and decision-making, which is really what Theosophy wants. We've heard it already in this conference, and certainly in other conferences, listen to other people's ideas. let people speak, listen to the ideas, build maybe some kind of consensus. Well, the Constitution does allow that. And no one can claim outside authority or any special knowledge of power, like God told me what to do, as a justification for exclusive authority. Again, very important. So it does open up a field of dialogue that is more democratic. It provides for a process of change. We haven't spoken of that much, but very much on the minds of the leaders of the day and the people of the day was we want some change. We want some change in the rules. We want the change in opportunities. We want to certainly get rid of all these British restrictions that are self-interested on the part of certain leaders in Britain. So the Constitution allows for change, particularly in the legislative process. You can change the elections. You can reconsider past decisions, which is what Congress is kind of doing now. But Roosevelt did that. No authority is infinite or timeless or immutable. That's just, if you don't carry away anything else, and nothing else, that one you should carry away. No authority is infinite, timeless, immutable. Experimentation is okay, and that's what this blueprint will allow for. Brotherhood and equality of opportunity valued. The Constitution certainly had its limitations. It did not end slavery. It made women citizens, but did not offer them the opportunity to vote. The Electoral College, not having a direct election of the president. But still, there is this, there's room for equality. And Hamilton, oddly enough, was one of the proponents of House of Representatives having an election every year, and that they be the source of financial initiatives. And people can participate in decision-making somewhere in the hierarchy, can challenge government authority, and the respect for views and needs of fellow citizens encouraged. And one of the things that did happen is within 30 years, in most of the states of the North, property requirements had been removed and the vote extended to all adult white males. And that was a big issue settled. So that's a leap towards democracy. We've already talked, consent of the governed is the source of legitimacy. Again, not God, not tradition, not the aristocracy. You give a very important role, you might say, to the people, even if it's not actively pursued. Another idea which we've already talked about, government and politics should promote the common good, not private interests. One of the complaints against George III is that he was a heavy investor in the British East India Company, and that's why he wanted more tea sold in Boston when there was a surplus, but he wanted to make money on this colony privately, as did a lot of other Englishmen at the time. And that's what they came to reject. And then freedom is a primary value and goal. If in Theosophy you have the idea of self-definition, of thinking things out for yourself, becoming more of an individual, understanding or acting upon the ideas that you did endorse, that this is why you need freedom of speech, press, petition, in government, peaceful assembly, one we forget about. No religion is to be adopted as the religion of the country, free exercise of religion, lots written on that. So we have to be very grateful for that First Amendment protection of freedoms. And then number of due process requirements we went through. The protection of citizens through due process, unless you're, we had a little bit of a raid on a former leader the other night, but some would say he deserved it. At 3 a.m., was that necessary? So we get some controversies stop and frisk or question your identity. There's always been violations of that. But what is important about it? It recognizes the dignity of each individual and the possibility that if, say, you arrest him for a crime and maybe he's guilty, but there is transformation is possible for every individual. So don't execute him necessarily, don't torture him, don't turn him into a negative force in society. Look to the opportunity for transformation. And they did talk about that very much. And that no constitution, no organization is inviolable. A healthy future may require amendments or a whole new blueprint for the exercise of authority. Jefferson's idea that every generation had the right to write its own constitution. And what's this famous phrase? The tree of liberty is awash with the blood of patriots, because you may have to do that to make sure that you can keep control of what government does, and the Constitution is supposed to do that. So you can see it did, in fact, stabilize the country. George Washington became president in April 1789. The Congress had gotten going, and even though they got into some huge political battles, some violations of the Constitution by the end of the decade, there was a path to the future provided by this document. So I'll end there, and sorry to keep you late.